Pay attention to this hospital CCTV footage from Melbourne, Australia. You're watching a woman walk through the emergency department hallway. She's calm, composed, checking her phone. Her name is Catherine Morrison, and she's here because 4 members of her family have just been rushed to this hospital with severe poisoning. Now watch her body language. She's not pacing anxiously. She's not crying or asking doctors for updates. She's just waiting, almost bored. A doctor approaches her with urgent questions about what the family ate at dinner. Catherine provides minimal answers, shows no emotion. Then, against medical advice, and while her family members are dying in nearby rooms, she signs herself out and leaves. The doctor watching her walk away will later tell police, her complete lack of concern was chilling. It wasn't shock, it wasn't grief, it was indifference. That doctor's observation will help crack open a case that reveals Catherine didn't just serve a bad meal. She served murder on a plate, with death cap mushrooms hidden in a beef Wellington. You know that feeling when a family member invites you over for dinner? It's usually something to look forward to. Good food, conversation, catching up. Maybe the meal won't be perfect, but it's made with love, right? For Don and Margaret Clarke, ages 68 and 66, a dinner invitation from their daughter-in-law Catherine seemed like a nice gesture. Catherine had been going through a difficult separation from their son James, and this felt like an olive branch, a chance to maintain family connections despite the marital troubles. On August 3, 2019, Don and Margaret drove to Catherine's house in a quiet suburb of Melbourne for what should have been a pleasant Saturday evening meal. James's aunt and uncle, Linda and Robert Parker, were also invited. It was going to be a small family gathering, nothing fancy. Catherine had promised to make beef Wellington, an impressive dish that takes hours to prepare properly. The recipe traditionally includes a mushroom duxelles, finely chopped mushrooms cooked with herbs and spices. Catherine told everyone she'd foraged some special mushrooms herself to make the dish extra authentic. Within 24 hours, Don and Margaret Clarke would be dead. Linda Parker would be dead, and Robert Parker would be fighting for his life in intensive care, saved only by an emergency liver transplant. This is the story of a dinner party that became a massacre, of a woman who used gourmet cooking to disguise murder, and of the warning signs that, in hindsight, showed this wasn't the first time Catherine Morrison had tried to poison her family. Let me take you back to the summer of 2019 to understand the relationship between Catherine Morrison and her estranged husband's family. Catherine was 48 years old, living in a modest house in suburban Melbourne. She and James Clarke had been married for 12 years, had 3 children together, but their marriage had been deteriorating for years. They'd separated in early 2019, though divorce proceedings hadn't officially begun. The separation was acrimonious. There were disputes about custody, about property division, about money. James's family, particularly his parents Don and Margaret, had been supportive of James during the split. Catherine felt they were taking his side, judging her, treating her as the villain in the marriage breakdown. But in late July 2019, Catherine reached out to James's family with what seemed like a peace offering. She wanted to have them over for dinner, to show there were no hard feelings, to maintain family relationships for the sake of the children. Don and Margaret were touched by the gesture. They missed seeing their grandchildren regularly and hoped this dinner might smooth things over. When Catherine mentioned she was also inviting James's Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert, it seemed like Catherine was genuinely trying to reconnect with the whole family. James was invited too, of course. He was supposed to be the 5th guest at this dinner party, but James made a decision that would save his life. He canceled at the last minute. James would later tell police that something about the invitation made him uncomfortable. Catherine had never been much of a cook during their marriage. They'd mostly eaten simple meals or takeaway. The idea of her suddenly preparing an elaborate beef Wellington seemed out of character. But there was another reason James stayed away. In the months before their separation, James had gotten mysteriously sick after eating meals Catherine prepared. 3 times he'd become violently ill, severe stomach pain, vomiting, diarrhea. bad enough to require hospitalization on one occasion. At the time, James had assumed it was food poisoning or maybe a stomach virus, but looking back, the pattern was suspicious. And when Catherine invited him to this dinner, some instinct told him to decline. So on August 3, 2019, Catherine called James mid-afternoon and asked if he was still coming. James made an excuse. Work had come up. He couldn't make it. Maybe another time. Catherine sounded disappointed but understanding. What James didn't know was that Catherine had specifically prepared enough poisonous mushrooms for 5 people. With James not coming, she'd have to adjust her plans. The dinner guests arrived at Catherine's house around 6 p.m. Don and Margaret brought wine. Linda and Robert brought flowers. Everyone was in good spirits, happy for a family gathering despite the underlying tensions of the separation. Catherine played the gracious host. She'd set the table nicely, had appetizers ready, seemed warm and welcoming. The guests relaxed, thinking maybe this dinner would help heal some family wounds. Around 7:30 p.m., Catherine served the beef Wellington. It looked impressive. Perfectly golden pastry wrapped around beef tenderloin, with what Catherine described as a special mushroom duxelles she'd made from mushrooms she'd foraged in a nearby park. Everyone praised the dish. It looked professional, almost restaurant quality. They ate enthusiastically, complimenting Catherine on her cooking skills. What none of them knew was that mixed in with the regular mushrooms in the duxelles were several deathcap mushrooms, Amanita phalloides, one of the most toxic mushrooms in the world. Deathcap mushrooms look deceptively ordinary and can taste pleasant, but they contain amatoxins that cause liver and kidney failure. Just half a deathcap mushroom can kill an adult. There's no antidote. Once you've ingested enough toxin, your organs will fail, and unless you receive a liver transplant, you will die. Catherine had deliberately foraged these mushrooms, carefully identified them, and incorporated them into the beef Wellington. She'd cooked them in a way that wouldn't destroy the toxins. Amatoxins are heat-stable and remain deadly even after cooking. The dinner party continued pleasantly. They had dessert, chatted about the children, avoided talking about the separation. Around 10 p.m., Don and Margaret left, followed shortly after by Linda and Robert. Everyone went home feeling the evening had been a success. A nice family dinner, good food, pleasant conversation. Maybe Catherine and James's separation wouldn't tear the whole family apart after all. But about 6 hours later, in the early hours of August 4th, the poisoning began. Don Clarke woke up at 4 a.m. with severe abdominal pain and violent vomiting. His wife Margaret was experiencing the same symptoms. They assumed it was food poisoning and tried to ride it out, but the symptoms got progressively worse. By 8 a.m., Don could barely stand. Margaret was becoming delirious. Their daughter, James's sister, found them in their home and immediately called an ambulance. Linda and Robert Parker were also sick. Robert had woken up around 5 a.m. with similar symptoms. Linda's symptoms started slightly later, but were equally severe. By midday on August 4th, all 4 dinner guests were in the emergency department at the same Melbourne hospital, suffering from what doctors initially thought was severe gastroenteritis or food poisoning. Catherine showed up at the hospital around 2 p.m. She told the emergency department staff she'd also eaten the beef Wellington and was experiencing some mild stomach upset. She wanted to be checked out. This is where things got strange. While Don, Margaret, Linda, and Robert were suffering terribly, vomiting, severe pain, deteriorating rapidly, Catherine seemed fine. She had no visible symptoms, no distress. She calmly answered questions about what they'd eaten, mentioned the beef Wellington and the foraged mushrooms, but showed no particular concern or alarm. The attending doctor, Dr. Rashid Khan, became suspicious immediately. 4 people with identical, severe symptoms after eating the same meal. One person, the cook, who claimed to have eaten the same food but had only mild symptoms, and that cook showing a disturbing lack of concern for her dying family members. Dr. Khan ordered toxicology screens on all 4 critical patients. When the results came back showing severe liver damage consistent with mushroom poisoning, he He knew they were dealing with something far worse than ordinary food poisoning. He confronted Catherine with the test results. "Did you use foraged mushrooms in the beef Wellington?" "Yes," Catherine admitted, "but they were safe mushrooms." "I've foraged mushrooms before. I know what I'm doing." Dr. Khan explained that her family members were experiencing liver failure consistent with death cap mushroom poisoning. They would need intensive treatment, possibly liver transplants, or they would die. Catherine's response chilled Dr. Khan. She didn't cry, didn't panic, didn't ask how this could have happened or how to help. She just nodded slowly and said, "I see." Then, despite Dr. Khan urging her to stay for observation and further questioning, Catherine signed herself out of the hospital against medical advice and left. Dr. Khan immediately called the police. When Melbourne detectives received the call from Dr. Khan about possible mushroom poisoning and a suspect acting suspiciously, they mobilized quickly. Detective Sergeant Emma Walsh was assigned as lead investigator. When she arrived at the hospital and spoke with Dr. Khan, his observations about Catherine's behavior raised immediate red flags. "She showed no emotion," Dr. Khan told Walsh. "4 people she'd cooked for were dying, and she acted like it was a minor inconvenience. Then she just left." By the evening of August 4th, less than 24 hours after the dinner party, the situation was dire. Don Clarke's liver had failed completely. Margaret was in liver failure. Linda Parker was deteriorating rapidly. Robert, the strongest of the 4, was holding on, but barely. Medical teams were doing everything they could: aggressive supportive care, attempts to remove toxins from the bloodstream, but with death cap poisoning, there's only so much medicine can do. The toxins had already caused catastrophic damage to vital organs. Detective Walsh went to Catherine's house that evening. Catherine answered the door calmly, invited Walsh inside, offered tea. "I understand 4 of your family members are critically ill from mushroom poisoning after eating dinner at your house last night," Walsh said. "I need to ask you some questions." Catherine nodded. "Of course, it's terrible. I can't believe this happened." But her tone didn't match her words. She sounded more inconvenienced than horrified. Walsh asked about the mushrooms. Where had Catherine foraged them? How did she identify them? Had she used a guide or expert to confirm they were safe? Catherine's answers were vague. She'd found them in a nearby park. She'd used an app on her phone to identify them. She thought they were safe mushrooms. She'd cooked with foraged mushrooms before without incident. "Did you eat the beef Wellington yourself?" Walsh asked. "Yes," Catherine said. "I had a small portion." "But you're not sick like the others." Catherine shrugged. "I must have gotten lucky. Or maybe I have a stronger constitution." Walsh requested permission to search Catherine's house. Catherine agreed, seeming unconcerned. The search revealed several concerning items. In Catherine's kitchen trash, investigators found mushroom stems and scraps. A forensic mycologist was called in to examine them. Preliminary identification suggested they were death cap mushrooms, Amanita phalloides. In Catherine's bedroom, detectives found printouts of articles about mushroom poisoning, including specific information about death cap mushrooms and their effects. The articles had been printed weeks before the dinner party. They also found a notebook with what appeared to be recipe notes. One page had calculations, weights and quantities that corresponded to lethal doses of amatoxin based on body weight. Catherine had researched, planned, and calculated exactly how to poison her dinner guests. On August 5th, Don Clarke died. His liver had failed completely, and there wasn't time to get him a transplant. He was 68 years old. Hours later, Margaret Clarke died as well, her body shutting down from the same organ failure. She was 66. Linda Parker died the following day, August 6th. 3 dead in 3 days. Robert Parker, James's uncle, survived only because he was moved to the top of the liver transplant list and received an emergency transplant on August 7th. The surgery saved his life, but he'd come within hours of dying. Detective Walsh arrested Catherine Morrison on August 6th and charged her with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. During interrogation, Catherine maintained her innocence. It had been a terrible accident. She thought the mushrooms were safe. She was devastated by what happened. She'd never meant to hurt anyone, but investigators weren't buying it. The evidence was too clear. The research articles about death cap mushrooms, the dose calculations in her notebook, her suspicious behavior at the hospital, her lack of emotional response. And then they learned about James's previous poisoning incidents. When police interviewed James Clarke about the dinner party and his decision not to attend, he revealed something that transformed the investigation. This wasn't Catherine's first attempt at poisoning family members. James described 3 incidents in the months before their separation, where he'd become violently ill after eating meals Catherine had prepared. The first incident was in December 2018. James had eaten a stew Catherine made, and within hours he was experiencing severe stomach pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. He'd gone to the hospital where doctors treated him for what they assumed was gastroenteritis. The second incident was in February 2019, after James had told Catherine he wanted a separation. He'd eaten leftover pasta Catherine had made, and again became seriously ill, so ill this time that he required a 2-day hospitalization. The third incident was in April 2019. James had stopped by Catherine's house to pick up some belongings, and Catherine had offered him coffee. Within an hour of drinking it, James was severely ill again, experiencing symptoms consistent with poisoning. After that third time, I stopped accepting any food or drink from Catherine, James told Detective Walsh. I thought maybe she was putting something in my food to make me sick. I had no proof, but the pattern was too suspicious to ignore. Medical records confirmed James's hospitalizations. Doctors had run basic tests, but hadn't suspected poisoning. They'd treated his symptoms as food poisoning or stomach viruses. No one had thought to test for toxins. But looking back with the knowledge of what Catherine had done to his family, James was convinced she'd been trying to poison him too. Maybe not with death cap mushrooms. Those attempts might have been practice runs, testing different substances, seeing if she could get away with it. Detective Walsh subpoenaed Catherine's internet search history and phone records. What they found was damning. Catherine had been researching poisons for over a year. She'd looked up information on various toxic plants and mushrooms. She'd read articles about symptoms of poisoning that could be mistaken for natural illness. She'd searched for undetectable poisons, and how long do mushroom toxins stay in the body? Most disturbingly, she'd been researching death cap mushrooms specifically for 3 months before the dinner party. She'd looked up where they grow in Victoria, how to identify them, how much is lethal, and whether cooking destroys the toxins. Catherine had also been having financial troubles. She and James's marital home was in both their names, along with significant debt. If James died before the divorce was finalized, Catherine would inherit everything: the house, his life insurance, his superannuation, retirement fund. The same applied to James's parents if James wasn't around to inherit from them. With James, his parents, and potentially other family members dead, Catherine stood to benefit significantly financially. The dinner party hadn't been about reconciliation. It had been about eliminating obstacles to Catherine's financial future. Prosecutors also discovered that Catherine had lied about eating the beef Wellington. Kitchen waste analysis showed she'd prepared 5 portions of the dish, 1 for each expected guest, but had only served 4 after James canceled. The 5th portion, with its poisonous mushrooms, had been disposed of in the outside bin. Catherine hadn't eaten any of the poisoned food. Her claim of mild illness at the hospital had been an act, an attempt to make it look like she'd been a victim too. Remember that hospital CCTV footage from the pre-intro? Prosecutors obtained all the hospital security footage from August 4th. The footage showed Catherine's behavior in the waiting area, checking her phone, appearing bored and unconcerned while just meters away, the people she'd poisoned were dying. The footage also captured her conversation with Dr. Khan. While there was no audio, body language experts analyzed the video. Catherine showed none of the physical signs of distress or shock you'd expect from someone who'd accidentally poisoned their family. No elevated breathing, No anxious movements, no protective gestures. She looked calm, almost detached. One forensic psychologist who reviewed the footage noted, "Her behavior is consistent with someone who expected exactly what was happening. There's no surprise, no horror, no guilt. She's just waiting to see if her plan worked." The trial preparation took months as prosecutors built their case. They had to prove Catherine had intentionally used death cap mushrooms, knew they were lethal, and deliberately fed them to her family with intent to kill. The evidence was overwhelming. The research on death cap mushrooms and poisons, the dose calculations in her notebook, the pattern of previous poisoning attempts on James, the financial motive, her suspicious behavior at the hospital, the CCTV footage showing her lack of concern, expert testimony about death cap mushrooms and their identification. Catherine's trial began in June 2021, nearly 2 years after the dinner party. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculating killer who'd planned multiple murders disguised as a tragic accident. The defense argued that Catherine had genuinely thought the mushrooms were safe, that she'd made a terrible mistake, that the internet searches were just curiosity, not planning. But the jury saw through it. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious. This wasn't an accident. This was murder, carefully planned and coldly executed. Robert Parker, the sole survivor, testified about the dinner and his ordeal. He described how enthusiastically Catherine had served the beef Wellington, how she'd specifically mentioned the special foraged mushrooms, how proud she'd seemed of the dish. "She watched us eat it," Robert told the jury. "She smiled and asked if we liked it, and the whole time, she knew she was feeding us poison." The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict, guilty on all counts. The conviction of Catherine Morrison brought some measure of justice to the Clarke and Parker families, though it could never bring back Don, Margaret, or Linda. At sentencing, the judge called the murders particularly cruel and calculating. She noted that Catherine had violated the most fundamental trust, the trust we place in people who cook for us, who invite us into their homes, who present themselves as loving family members. "You used hospitality as a weapon," the judge told Catherine. "You presented poisoned food with a smile, watched your victims eat it, and showed no remorse as they died. The cruelty of your actions is almost incomprehensible." James Clarke gave a victim impact statement that brought the courtroom to tears. He talked about the guilt he felt for canceling that dinner, guilt that his cancellation might have triggered Catherine to go ahead with the poisoning anyway. He talked about losing both his parents and his aunt in one terrible weekend. He talked about the trauma his children had experienced, knowing their mother had murdered their grandparents. "My children have nightmares," James said. "They're terrified of eating anything they didn't see prepared." They lost their grandparents and their mother in the same week, one to death, one to prison. Catherine destroyed our entire family for money. Robert Parker, the survivor, also spoke. He described the months of recovery after his liver transplant, the ongoing health issues, the survivor's guilt of being the only one who made it. He talked about the trauma of knowing he'd sat at Catherine's table, eaten her food, and barely escaped with his life. The case led to increased public awareness about the dangers of foraging wild mushrooms. Mycology experts conducted educational campaigns warning people that death cap mushrooms grow commonly in Australia and can easily be mistaken for edible varieties. Several states implemented stricter regulations around foraging, and poison control centers reported increased calls from people worried they'd accidentally consumed toxic mushrooms. The hospital where Dr. Khan worked established new protocols for suspected poisoning cases, including mandatory police notification when patient behavior suggests possible criminal intent. Dr. Khan, whose quick thinking and suspicion had helped build the case against Catherine, was commended for his actions. "Trust your instincts," he said in interviews. "If something feels wrong, it probably is." Catherine's behavior wasn't normal for someone whose family was dying. That lack of appropriate emotion was the first real clue that this was intentional. Catherine's children were placed with James and his sister. They underwent extensive therapy to process the trauma of what their mother had done. James changed their surnames and moved to a different state, trying to give them a fresh start away from the media attention and community judgment. The beef Wellington recipe, once considered an elegant dish, became associated with the case in Australia. Some restaurants stopped serving it for a while, and dinner party hosts joked nervously about doing a Catherine Morrison when serving mushroom dishes. Catherine Morrison was convicted on the following charges: 3 counts of first-degree murder for Don Clarke, Margaret Clarke, and Linda Parker, and 1 count of attempted murder for Robert Parker. She was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms for the murders, plus 25 years for the attempted murder. She will die in prison and is ineligible for parole. Don Clarke was 68 years old, a retired electrician, a devoted grandfather who loved spending time with his family. Margaret Clarke was 66, a former nurse, known for her kindness and generosity. Linda Parker was 63, a teacher who'd touched hundreds of students' lives. They accepted a dinner invitation from family, trusting that the meal served with love would be safe. They died painfully, their organs failing from poison, never knowing until too late that someone they'd trusted had deliberately murdered them. Rest in peace to Don, Margaret, and Linda. You deserved so much better than the death you received. Your family honors your memory and ensures that the world knows you were victims of calculated murder, not a tragic accident. And may your story remind us all that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones sitting across the dinner table, smiling as they serve your meal.